Good morning. Frank has decided to join us for the next element, and arguably the most important element of sexual harassment, which is severe or pervasive. This is the one where a sexual harassment claim basically rises and falls. The other elements can sometimes be relatively easy to prove, unwelcome and based on sex, but severe or pervasive is where the rubber really hits the road. And it's got a lot of pieces to it, so I'm going to need you to bear with me as I kind of go through them. The or is really important. It is not severe and pervasive. It is severe or pervasive. So if you can establish unwelcome conduct based on sex, you then have to prove that it was either really, really bad or it pervaded the workplace, or both, but you don't have to prove both. Now, the case law on this is very fact specific. And what that means is that every single case is going to be a little snowflake when it comes to what is severe or pervasive. There's no list out there that says, touching somebody's butt is severe, but touching somebody's shoulder is not, right? You have to look at the case law for your particular jurisdiction in your particular court. And everything is going to be taken, again, as a totality of the circumstances in the context of that particular workplace. Under Title VII, which is the federal law, I'm not going to talk about differences in the California law that Blake Lively filed under because I'm not a California lawyer, and I think it's pretty similar. But under the federal law, typically you are looking at a whole bunch of different factors. The factors are the frequency with which something happened, the severity, whether it was physically intimidating or humiliating, whether it actually interfered with your job, and whether it was just offensive. Those are things that are going to be considered in looking at the totality of the circumstances. So Blake Lively has asserted that 4 different incidents at this point were either alone severe or together pervasive enough to meet this element of sexual harassment. So generally, the law is that Title VII, the discrimination law for employers, is not a civility code. In other words, it does not exist to tell people to be nice to each other in the workplace. It exists to make sure that workplaces do not become hostile and abusive. And I know that we are all, because of this case, thinking about this in the context of sexual harassment, but the exact same analysis applies under Title VII with the same elements for a racially harassing workplace. So if you just took out all of the things I'm about to say about severe or pervasive sexual harassment and put in racial harassment, it's the same exact analysis. I find that sometimes helps me sort of see things a little bit more clearly because it's like, would it be bad? Would it be offensive if it was a racial comment? It might be more likely to be offensive because it's a sexual comment simply because of the way that we think. So the workplace environment, when you are looking at severe or pervasive, you look at it all in context. You look at everything that happened cumulatively, and you do look at the social context of the particular work environment. And I think that's where this case gets really tricky is what's the typical social context of filming a sex scene or filming a birthing scene on a movie. So that's all going to be taken into consideration. There are plenty of cases out there, and if you don't know this already, I'm sorry to ruin your day, but there are plenty of cases out there in the federal courts that say kissing someone at work, grabbing someone at work, and making sexual advances towards someone at work are not severe or pervasive enough for sexual harassment. That's just the law. I know that pisses people off, and I'm not saying I agree with it, but that is the law in many, many circuits. But on the other hand, there have been cases where just words alone can be enough for sexual harassment. For example, if you have somebody in the workplace who's always calling every woman in the workplace bitches, hey bitches do this, hey bitches do that, hey bitches do this, without even touching anybody, if that goes on all of the time and it changes their experience in the workplace, that could be enough for sexual harassment. So again, there's no bright line of like touching is severe or pervasive and words aren't. It's always going to be a mix. The law is also very clear that it has to, for something to be severe or pervasive enough to be sexual harassment, it has to permeate the entire workplace. It can't just be episodic, right? Like it happened this day and then for 3 weeks it was fine. And then there was an offensive thing again. And then 2 days later it was okay. And then there was another offensive thing. The legal standard is it has to be permeating the workplace with intimidation, ridicule, or insult for it to be severe or pervasive. An isolated incident is not going to be pervasive, although it could be severe, right? So I think in this case, Blake Lively's best argument for severe would be the birthing scene. Like the whole circumstances of all of that with the video and being half naked, this is what she alleges, being half naked and then having Baldoni's friend come in and being like, that could be, that whole situation alone was severe. If no one thing alone is severe, then it has to be pervasive. Facially sex neutral things can be found to be sexual harassment. So if it's like, you know, yeah, they did that to men too, but it only affected the women in a certain way, that can be severe or pervasive. If looking at the context of it, it rises to that level. Another thing that's really important to note, because I know that especially for the retaliation claim, it's a big issue of like, did she complain about this at the time? And that matters as an element of retaliation. You don't have to have complained about it at the time for it to be sexual harassment and to satisfy a sexual harassment claim. However, whether you complained at the time can be evidence of whether you thought it was severe or pervasive. So this is the other part of severe or pervasive. It has to be both objectively and subjectively to the person making the claim. So Blake Lively has to show that she herself thought it was severe or pervasive, and that a reasonable person, I could do a whole 10 video series on what a reasonable person is, but the law loves to find like a reasonable person in the same circumstances and say, what would that person think? And for purposes of this case, the reasonable people are kind of us analyzing this from the sidelines. So it has to be that she thought it was and that a reasonable person would think it was. So the fact that whether or not she complained about it at the time is not something she has to prove, but it is relevant to what she was thinking at the time and whether a reasonable person would think that somebody in those circumstances would have gone and complained. Lastly, I have not talked about this a lot, about the difference between Justin Baldoni as an individual being sued for sexual harassment and then Wayfarer, It Ends With Us LLC, Jamie Heath as its CEO, those people being held liable for sexual harassment. Everything starts with the individual sexual harassment, right? The employer, whether the employer is liable depends on whether the individual is liable. So Justin Baldoni would have to be found responsible for sexual harassment for Wayfarer or It Ends With Us LLC or any of those companies to be found responsible for sexual harassment. And not only would it depend on the proof for Baldoni as an individual, employer liability then has other elements to it, like whether that employer knew that it was happening and failed to do something about it and all that kind of stuff. So just to note that when I'm making these videos about sexual harassment elements, I'm talking about the individuals, Justin and Blake. Let me know what questions you have about severe and pervasive. We're almost to the end. We're getting there.